All right, to get us started, just very quickly, when they asked me to do this, they said just do economics of grazing, which is about like saying to agronomists, just do something on forages. So in other words, I had to kind of decide on exactly what to do related to that, and could have done a lot of different things, and for better or worse, I decided on the topic we're going to talk about here today, and hopefully what we can talk about why as we get into it. So if we look at extended season grazing, this picture was 2 years ago in early to mid-January, and so generally I think all of us that are raising livestock, this is our ideal. We want to be out there grazing in January, February, potentially even March. As we'll see, there's a trade-off to doing that, and that's what we're going to look at today is to see what that cost is to actually getting to this point. And for some folks, they may not want to shoot for 365 days of grazing here. Some people will, and some people will be more profitable doing that. But that's essentially what we're going to try to do here today is for a particular farm with their circumstances, how much hay feeding days is probably optimal for their operation. And I'm going to put it in a format so that you can look at different scenarios and try to figure out which one is appropriate for your farm, your given circumstances, and hopefully kind of decide where that should be. So to get us moving on this, or to get going into it, let's think about, so if we're trying to, we're going from feeding hay 6 months out of the year, some people still do that, even in Kentucky. So we're moving towards grazing further into the winter. So what do we do first? In other words, what's the low-hanging fruit? Because if, just as with any agriculture enterprise, we're going to try to figure out what are the cheapest things to do first, right? To kind of get us in the right direction. So think about that in terms of extended season grazing. So this might be an example of that low-hanging fruit. So something that's feeding hay 6 months out of the year and is doing continuous grazing. The first low-hanging fruit might be just going to rotational grazing. That may actually increase, they may be able to increase their stocking rate and maybe even reduce hay feeding at the same time. May even be learning how to get a good clover stand mixed into the pasture rather than relying on nitrogen. That's probably the low-hanging fruit for a lot of folks. What about the high-hanging fruit? So once we've kind of done the easy things, we're grazing further into the winter, what are some of the last things that we're probably going to do to get additional grazing days? Again, I'm just trying to get you to think conceptually here. So this may be one of them. So this would be mid-December a couple of years ago. So basically just doing a little more intense grazing. So this is on a rental property, don't have electric, so using portable energizer setting. So a little bit more work to do it. But by that time, every day essentially that I can get extra grazing days is going to save me what in mid-December? A hay feeding day, right? So in other words, I can afford to do a little more intense rotations. And this is just me personally, but the last thing that I've done to try to stretch that winter stockpile, because I don't actually live on the farm that I have the cattle on, it's about 4 miles away, I have what is called a bat latch, and all that essentially is a solar powered timer. It has a little cam on it. When that timer goes off, and I can set that anywhere from now to actually 2 weeks, not that I'd send it that far ahead of time. When that goes off, that cam turns, and that spring gate opens, and the cattle let themselves into the next paddock. It's expensive, it's $400, but essentially that's allowing me to be a little more intensive, get a few more grazing days into the wintertime. So think about once we've done, and different people are going to have different high-hanging fruit, right? For some other farms, maybe different things, but once we picked all that high-hanging fruit, what's the last thing that we can do essentially to reduce hay feeding? This would be kind of the last thing. And it's also going to be probably one of the most costly things that you can do. So we picked the low-hanging fruit, we picked a lot of the high-hanging fruit. At some point, what's the last thing we're going to be able to do? The only thing we're going to be able to do to reduce feeding hay in the winter on an average year. Reduce our stocking rate, right? And what is the cost of reducing our stocking rate? A lot of people, we don't like to talk about this. A lot of folks think we can just keep grazing in the winter, but at some point, the only way to do that is to reduce that stocking rate. That essentially means we have fewer calves to sell, right, on that same farm. And that's what we're going to look at here, that essentially the rest of the presentation is that trade-off. And we're assuming we're eliminating all that low-hanging fruit, and in the end, we're going to have to figure out how much are we going to have to reduce our stocking rate to get to whatever number of hay feeding days we desire getting down to? And we'll look at 1 month increments. So just conceptually, and this is kind of the forest before the trees, before we kind of potentially get lost in the trees, just conceptually, let's think about how this would work. So just real simple table here. So on the top, we have high hay cost, low hay cost. So if the price of hay is really expensive, are you in general going to want to feed more or less of it? You're going to want to hopefully feed less of it. And what about profitability? So this would be base profitability for your cattle operation. So if your cattle operation has a really high profit, is stocking going to have more of a cost or less of a cost compared to if it was low profitability? It's going to be more costly, right? So in other words, you're going to tend to have a lower stocking rate in which one of those situations? Low profitability, right? In other words, you can afford to feed less hay in that situation because your lower stocking rate isn't costing you as much, right? And so just conceptually, that's what we're going to look at. So take the two extremes. So let's say we have high hay cost. So that means we don't want to feed a lot of hay, right? And if we have low base profitability, means we're probably going to have a lower stocking rate, right? Which means what? We can afford to have fewer cows and not feed much hay, right? In that situation. Let's take the other extreme. Let's say we have low hay cost, really cheap hay. Are we going to tend to feed more or less? We're going to feed more, right? And if we have a really high base profitability per cow, are we going to want a high or low stocking rate? We're going to want a high stocking rate, right? So that's going to be the other extreme. We're going to tend to have a high stocking rate and feed a lot of hay in that situation, and everything else would be somewhere in between those two extremes. So just conceptually, does everyone kind of understand what we're doing here? Again, this is the forest because we're going to get it in the trees here, the weeds, and we might get lost in those. So, but if we're good with conceptually what's going on, I think we'll be in better shape. All right, so no questions before we get into the trees. Are we good? All right. So I'm going to present two different scenarios here, two different essentially stocking rate scenarios. This is the first one. Just very quickly, let me explain how this is working. So on the left-hand side, that's how many days, and of course, it will change year to year, but think about this on average. On an average year, how much hay are you going to have to feed? Everything from the top, from 150 days, which would be 5 months, down to 0 in essentially 30-day or 1 month increments. And on the top, that would be our stocking rate, how many cows, and we're just going to assume a 100-acre farm here. So how many cows for that 100-acre farm? And by the way, let's assume that we've got really good management here. So in other words, the 150 hay feeding days is going to be the same level of management as the 0 hay feeding days. Does that make sense? We're going to be fair on that. And then the amount of hay that we're feeding is on the right-hand side. And by the way, this doesn't really matter what your size. This particular one, in terms of how many head of cattle and how much hay we're going to feed, this would be for 1,300-pound cows on average. If you have 1,000-pound cows, obviously decrease that by 30%, whatever it works out to. But the same general results will hold in either of these. You're just going to have more cows with smaller weights. So let's get started here. This would be stocking rate, the first one. We'll look at two different scenarios. And so again, this is with very good management on that. For 150 hay feeding days on a 100-acre farm, we could probably have somewhere around 57 cows. Here we're assuming we're going to, and this would be for spring calving herd we're selling in the fall in terms of calves. So now as we're targeting essentially in 1 month increments in terms of less hay that we're going to feed, how much are we going to have to destock? So going from 5 months to 4 months, we're going to cut about 7 cows. Go down to 30 months, again, it keeps going down. There's 2 months hay feeding, 1 month, and then to get down in this scenario to no hay feeding, which realistically means you're going to probably want 1 or 2 weeks of hay on hand, right? You may not use it, but for emergency purposes, we're going to have about 24 cows. Or that works out to be about 41% of what we started with 150 hay feeding days. The amount of hay fed is on that right-hand side. So obviously the extreme where we're feeding 5 months out of the year, we're at 160 tons of hay. Now if we compare the two, again, the bottom is 41% of the, so we're stocked at roughly 41% of what we're at in the top. if we look at in terms of forage utilization on the right, and basically that means out of every 100 pounds of forage that we grow on the farm, how much are we actually going to get is going to be consumed by the cows? It's going to vary here. So we've got a high of 69% up here and a low of 46% down here. By the way, you have different opinions here, but most of what I've heard is with exceptional management, the best you're going to probably do is about 70%, somewhere in that ballpark. Now, why would the forage utilization be so much higher with a higher stocking rate? We're going to graze more days down here, right? So you might think that should be the same, but what's the main factor driving that? Why are the cows using so much less of that overall forage? It's a waste, so why are they wasting it? Or when are they wasting most of it? So I'm from Kentucky, I'm not here in Missouri, but in Kentucky, generally, and it will vary year to year, but generally by about third week of April to probably second week of June, I could double my stocking rate. And I'm still not going to have enough cattle on that farm. So in other words, and I'm probably more stocked in this range or this range, but in other words, if we double 50 to 100 and I can't keep up with it, what are we doing with 24 cows? We got a lot of forage that we're going to waste, right? So that's what's driving that.
Aren't you bailing it up?
We're not bailing any this year. Yeah, so very quick. So in these here, we'll get to that at the end, but here I'm assuming that we're not even in these situations here, we're getting our hay from somewhere else. We're either renting another farm. So essentially this is 100 acres of pasture, and we're assuming we're not going to. Now, in reality, in some of these lower stocking rates, we could make some of that hay on that farm, a limited amount, probably up to 60 tons or so. Let's talk about that then. So right now, let's assume that we're either making the hay on a different farm or we're buying our hay.
And this forage utilization is just ideal. It's not on the farm forage utilization.
This would be on the farm forage utilization. For that 100-acre farm, out of every 100 pounds that we grow, essentially we're saying we're going to consume 69 pounds here and 46 pounds here on that 100-acre farm. Other questions? All right, so that's the first stocking rate, and so I'll present a second one here. This will benefit, or it'll be a little more advantageous to the extended season grazing. And basically all it does is it's going down a little slower. So instead of having 24 cows down here, we're 28, 29 cows. And in terms of forage utilization, this will kind of show you what's going on. It bumps up from 46% to 56%. So folks, we're getting real close where my guess is this is probably the upper limit in terms of what we're going to do. So a couple quick things here. I'm not going to say that you could get down to 0 hay feeding days and not have more than 28 cows on that farm. If you're on really good soils, you might do that, but what's going to happen up here? That's also going to go up. So don't worry so much about if you're up here or you're here, the exact numbers. Think about the ratio between those. This is exactly half, so 28.5 is exactly 50% of that 57. So think more in terms of that ratio rather than the absolute numbers. All right, any quick questions there? So in other words, you'll have two scenarios to pick from, because it'll make a difference in terms of what stocking rate scenario that you're looking at. All right, so let's talk about hay costs. And when I say hay cost, I mean net hay cost. So this is going to be the value of the hay minus any nutrient value of hay, and that will depend on how it's fed and where it's fed. So let me give you a few examples. So you're going to have three choices, $40, $60, and $80 a ton hay. And here's just an example. So let's say the cost of your hay was $70, and that would include delivery, so you have to add that in there if you're buying it. And let's say in this case that you've estimated the nutrient value of that hay as you're feeding it. Again, it will depend on how you're doing. It's $10 per ton. The net hay cost will be what? $60 a ton. Now, it makes a big difference how you're feeding that hay. So I'll give you a couple examples. What do you think, how much nutrient value do you think this person's getting out of their hay in this picture? Not a whole lot. By the way, that's an NRCS stack pad up there, which are touted as what? Being an ecologically friendly way of feeding, which they can be, but my only point here is engineering approach doesn't always solve the problem. So I think we can all agree that most of the nutrients are ending up where we don't want them here. So maybe $5 a ton. They're walking around a little bit, right? So the net nutrient or the net hay cost there would be $65 a ton. Now let's compare it to another extreme. This is in Greene County, Kentucky, a farm I've been working with for 3 years now. This is bale grazing. So this is where you put hay out in the pasture, you move the fence, you roll the hay rings. Can you see how maybe the nutrients would be just deposited a little bit differently in that last picture? Now the next picture is not going to be right there. It's in the next pasture that they bale grazed when I got out there the next time, but this is what it looked like. How do you think the nutrient value of that hay in this situation compares? A little bit better? And it will depend on the exact situation, but I could pretty easily say we can get $20 a ton out of that in terms of what is being deposited there. In that case, our net hay cost would be $50 a ton. And if you can get your hay cheap enough, if you're buying it and delivering it for $60 a ton, that would be about $30 for a 5x5 bale delivered. I got those bales delivered for $32 about a month and a half ago. If we're getting that, what's our net hay cost? About $40 a ton. So it really makes a difference, number one, the cost of the hay and then how you're feeding it. And that's why I'll give you those 3 different choices. Additional costs. So essentially, we're going to have the same size farm, right? And all we're talking about is having fewer or more cows, right? So are we going to do we have to consider all the costs that you would typically think about in a cow-calf operation? What costs aren't going to change whether we have 20 cows or 40 cows or 60 cows? Is your pasture rent going to change? No. Or your fencing costs, right? Your fencing depreciation. Those aren't going to change. So let's think about what only those costs are going to change as we increase or decrease cows or what we're going to consider. So big one is going to be hay. In other words, if we have 10 more cows, we're going to have 10 more cows we're going to feed hay if we're feeding hay. So those will be kind of on a one-to-one basis, right? If we have one more cow, we're going to have the full cost. And by the way, for the second line, that's machinery and labor, that would be increased cost going from grazing to feeding hay for machinery and labor costs, just the difference between the two. The second one, the labor, that's just general labor, so not feeding hay, but think about during the summer. So first of all, if you doubled your cow herd, so not considering feeding actual hay, but just rotational grazing through the summer, if you doubled your cow herd, are your labor costs going to double on the same 100 acres? Answer is no, right? You can move them just about as easily. So what I'm doing is I'm allocating about 1/4 of what I would say is total labor to additional labor. Does that make sense? So in other words, we double our cow herd, we're going to increase let me simplify it. If we increase our cow herd from 20 to 40, we're going to double our labor in that situation, going up by 25%. What about mineral and vet? Would those go up 1-to-1? If we have another cow, we're going to have what? One more cow that we've got to give mineral, that we have vet bills, et cetera. So those are going to go up 1-to-1. Breeding and marketing, trucking, same type of thing, right? Those kind of go up on a 1-to-1 basis. You could argue breeding would be lumpy, right, depending on if you have a bull or AI, but on general, they're going to go up 1-to-1. And then other costs, this might be water for me. I'm on county water. It will depend on the situation, but everyone here is going to have just miscellaneous costs that you need to consider. So I've got $17. The next biggest one, and unfortunately one that a lot of people ignore or don't think about, is that last one, cow depreciation interest. So if I had another cow, I'm going to have to what? Either buy another cow or develop my own heifers, which, by the way, usually the cost is just as much or sometimes more for some folks that we're going to have to consider, right? And just very quickly, because it's that important, I'll just show you a very quick way to think about this. All you need is 4 pieces of information. On average, what that bred heifer or what the cost of developing that heifer is going to be, purchase price, how many years on average you're going to keep that heifer or that cow, the call value, and interest rate. So just quickly, very easy, take the purchase price, subtract out what your expected call value is going to be. That's how much you've lost in value, or that's how much the cow did what? Depreciate, right? So in that case, $800. If we divide $800 by 8 years, made the math easy, works out to what? $100 per year. For interest, this is not exact financial, but for most folks, just because it's easier calculation, just take the average. If we went from $1,600 to $800, your average value in between would be how much? $1,200. Take that average value and multiply it by your interest rate, so 4%, so it's about another $50. That's a little high in terms of where we're at right now, just an example. But right now, probably in the $100 to $125 range, somewhere in there. So we add all those up together, and we've got $450 of total cost. Now again, that doesn't include some of those fixed costs, right? Doesn't include the depreciation on the fencing or land rent, doesn't include equipment depreciation. Because it doesn't matter how many cows we have in that farm, we're going to have all those, right? All right, so the reason I'm doing all this is because this is what's going to tie into your base profitability, right? It's going to matter if you're making a lot of money or not making much on a per cow basis of additional cow. So we've got $450 of cost. And this is just an example. I'll fill in more detail here to give you. But if we sold average 525 pound steer heifer mix for $1.23, it'd work out to about $650. If we adjusted that by 85% weaning rate, that would be our effective revenue, $550. Again, made the math easier here. So if we subtract the cost from that, what's our gross return? $100. So everyone see how that works. That's just going to be one of many that we'll show here, but just I made the math easy. But again, it does not account for those fixed costs that will be the same regardless of how many cows we have on there. So essentially, we're doing like a partial budget here. Now, so first of all, right now, especially here in Missouri, I'm guessing in Kentucky, although the market went down last week, but my guess is probably an average steer heifer that size in Kentucky probably last week brought $1.55. So here in Missouri, it's going to be a little higher, you're closer to feedlots. But are we concerned just with this year's price if we're going to keep a cow for 8 years? You got to think what? Next 8 years, right? So what I'm doing here is giving my best estimate for whatever it's worth, and I'll show you how you can adjust. So if you think later on the prices that you're thinking are higher than this or lower, very easy to adjust. We'll do that at the very end. But let me just fill this in. Here are kind of my price expectations for the next 8 years. So I'm saying there's a 5% chance we could either sell those calves for 80 cents or $2.35, 1 in 20 years for each. 15% chance each will have $1 or $1.90 calves, and then essentially the bulk of it will be somewhere between $1.20 and $1.50. That'd be average steer heifer mix. Again, if you think that those prices are low or high, we can adjust those, or you can adjust those later on. It's fairly easy. It works out that the average steer heifer price is about $1.40 when you average all that out. So don't again, if you think it should be higher or lower, don't worry so much about that. You can adjust at the very end. All right, so this is the most important table, and we'll have a couple of these, one for each stocking rate scenario. So let me explain what's going on here. These are the 3 net hay price, so 40, 60, 80. So you pick the one that you feel is most representative for your farm. On the left, and this is just with those prices we looked at, essentially average $1.40. And then we'll start with stocking rate number 2. So this is the one that goes down to 28.5 down here. We'll start there and show the other one. Now, just very conceptually, if we're at $40 per ton net hay, is that relatively cheap or relatively expensive? Relatively cheap. So just in general, do you think on most farms you're going to want a high or low stocking rate? Probably high, right? At least relatively. So just be prepared. So in other words, let me do one more slide. So the way this works is we're always going to compare, as we go down each of these columns, we're always going to compare the 150 hay feeding days, every one of those. So the one that's highlighted right now in yellow, that number there is going to compare, if we go from 150 to 120 hay feeding days, how much are we going to change in total profit? So if it's negative, it means we want to stay at 150, and if it's positive, it means we move down. Does that make sense? So what would you expect if we have really cheap hay? What would you expect that number right there to be, positive or negative? Probably negative, right? And it is by about $170. So in other words, but that's for that whole total 100 acres. So in other words, not a whole lot of difference. In other words, you really aren't going to see the difference there. So no big difference. But as we move down, what do you think is going to happen to these numbers here? They're going to get, or more negative, I think is what you mean, right? And they do. So here's minus 300, minus 800, minus 1,500, and minus 2,000. So just make sure we understand the interpretation here. So this doesn't necessarily mean that we lost $2,000 if we're trying to feed no hay. It just means relative to here, we would have been $2,000 better off here. So in other words, if we made $3,000 here, what did we make here? $1,000. But again, this is with very cheap hay, so this probably shouldn't be completely unexpected, be my guess. Now, what's going to happen is we move to more expensive hay. These numbers are going to tend to do what? Get reversed. In other words, either less negative or more positive. Does that make sense? You potentially get confusion when you have negative, positive, you understand. Anyways, they're going to kind of go up. All right, and by the way, so from here on, just because we have this table, one more, I'm just going to fill these in and just highlight in yellow roughly where that max is. Anywhere within a few $100s, again, we're not going to be able to tell the difference. Or would you all agree? So in other words, with really cheap hay, somewhere in this range is going to be our ideal. All right, so $60 ton hay, again, I'm just going to highlight anywhere from being down near 0 hay feeding days all the way up to 90. Didn't really make a big difference, but that's kind of your optimal. And if hay is really expensive, where do you think we're going to want to be? Really low, right? Somewhere down there, 0 to 30 days hay feeding. So any questions here? We're going to look at one more table. So this is the stocking rate that's a little bit more advantageous to extended season grazing because our stocking rate isn't going down as quickly. Let me back up one. So again, this doesn't mean we made $4,500 here. We could have lost $2,000 here, and what did we make here? $2,500. So it's all relative. So let me back up here. So if we go back to 60-ton net hay, we had quite a range where essentially there's no difference. Does that make sense? In other words, we could have had 2 guys sitting at the bar, 2 girls sitting at the bar. One is feeding no hay, the other's feeding 3 months of hay, and they're both arguing with each other what? That their way is the best way, right? In the end, did it really make any difference in that situation? They're both right, or they're both wrong, you know. So let's look at scenario 1. So this is a little less advantageous to extend season grazing, so it's going to cost a little bit more as we destock. So in general, what's going to happen to those numbers? Or what's going to happen to the ideal, those yellow numbers? They're all going to get pushed up a little bit, right? Just a little bit. So again, I'm just going to fill them in, highlight. So before I think we're somewhere between 90 and 150, so now we're 120 to 150, somewhere in there. 60-ton hay, before the ideal was here. Now that ideal is shifted up to 90 to 120. And if hay is really expensive, we're still down here, but kind of where 60-ton hay was before, you could be anywhere from 0 to 9 days. It's not going to make a big difference. They're all going to be about the same profitability.
What was the difference in the last 2 charts, Greg? I'm saying this one and the one that we showed.
Yes. So this one down here, so again, this one you go down to about 23, 24 cows. The other one you're going to 28, 29 cows. So it's just how quickly does that stocking rate go down to get down to 0 hay feeding. So the other one was more advantageous to 0 hay feeding days just because the stocking rate. In other words, here we're 41% of our stocking rate. Here, the other one we're 50% of our stocking rate.
Why did it take one to go down to that rate to get to 0 hay feeding days and the other one it was different? I never thought that.
Say that again.
Okay, so in this one it takes 23 head to get to 0 hay feeding days. Why in the other chart?
Is it different?
Yeah.
Because the answer is we don't know. So I'm giving you 2 options because there's not good research in terms of what are we going to. And the problem is I can give you a bunch of examples where we're here. I can give you a bunch of, but what I can't do is show you what that would be relative to that because we don't have that control. You will not find that data. And why won't you find that data? There's a lot of variables, and you're going to have a bunch of farms, and you're going to have, it's not out there. Now, what do I think is more realistic? I actually think this one is right here. But in case you don't, if you think you can get closer to that 50%, then that you can use that other table. That's a good question. So what is the ideal number of hay feeding days? Hopefully you understand now the answer what? It depends, right? It depends on things that we know fairly well in terms of hay cost, but the one that we don't is a big one, stocking rate. That's why I'm giving you 2 different tables to choose from. And again, I don't know for sure. I think the second one, or number one, is probably more realistic. But since I don't know, what I'm going to do next is just average 2. In other words, if we don't know and we average 2, what would the ideal hay feeding days be? So here's number 2, right? And all I want you to do is look at where that yellow is, and I'll show you one, look at where the yellow is, and we'll kind of do the overlap, if that makes sense. So here's 2, here's 1. If we just look at that, I'm sorry, we'll do it one at a time. So let's isolate 1. Here's number 2, here's number 1. If we just look at the overlap, it's right about there, right? So in other words, and we don't, so if we don't really know what that relative stocking rate is, I'm saying it's probably, let's average 2, somewhere between 60 and 90 days is probably a good target. And we'll fill that in. What about 40-ton hay? Here's number 2, here's number 1. The overlap is probably in that 90 to 120 days. So we'll fill that in. And if we have really expensive hay, there's number 2, there's number 1. Probably the overlap is right there, 0 to 60 days of hay feeding. So now how are we doing on time?
You got about 7 or 8 minutes.
Perfect. So I've got plenty of time to get through the rest. So I wasn't sure. So this was in case I ran out of time, this was my end point. But now we can adjust if you think we have higher or lower price sets. So perfect. So before we get to that, before we get to the real, getting into the branches of the trees, any questions on the trees? Okay. So let's talk about, and actually I forgot, it's just a new slide. Before we talk about adjusting, here's some caveats. Here's some things I did not essentially incorporate into the analysis. So the first is forage quality. So if I'm feeding hay, average quality hay in October or November versus good pasture, there's no question which is going to have better quality. That pasture is. Now, if I'm feeding decent quality hay in late winter versus stockpile on an average year, then it's very questionable. On some years, the quality of that stockpile is going to be better. This year, the quality of that stockpile when I got into mid-February was worse than the hay. And I was told here by someone I talked to in Missouri, it was the same thing. You guys, like us, had 2 really hard freezes, right, where it got down to about 0 degrees or in the negatives for about 4 to 7 days at a time. After that second freeze on my farm, I noticed as soon as after the second freeze, when it warmed up, got up to 50 degrees, after that second day, the cattle would hardly touch my stockpile. And the best way I can describe it is after that second freeze, it just sucked out all the nutrients. By the way, same time my kale plants all died in my garden. The nutrients were gone. So they would eat it, but they just wouldn't eat it. So they were hitting the hay before they're hitting the stockpile. Normally they'll hit the stockpile before the hay because I feed both. I bale graze and I give them a strip of stockpile and I have a couple bales inside. So I can very quickly see which they prefer. And at that time, they actually were telling me the hay was better quality than the stockpile. So in other words, forage quality will matter. We'll probably, anyways, so we can talk a little bit more about that later. Here's another thing I didn't control for, and that's the possibility of using that spring surplus. In other words, where we have that flush, and we're in other situations where we're fully utilizing it, there is a possibility that we could do something to utilize more of that. So one would be, if we wean our calves, this is probably more applicable for fall calving herds. In other words, fall calving herd, you're weaning the calves when? In spring. If you keep those calves for 2 or 3 months until what? Till midsummer when the grass is slowing down, you could essentially utilize some. So for fall calving herd, that would change it a little bit. Another one would be making hay out of it, right? Now, we're not going to be able to make all the hay we need for 150 hay feeding days, but I guarantee you we can do that for 30 or 60 or maybe 90 days of hay feeding. If we have a 100-acre farm and we just set aside 20 acres, which I could do easily, and if I'm getting 2 tons an acre, which I would normally get 2.5, I could have 50 tons of hay fairly easily on 20 acres. And I promise you that 20 acres I would not notice it by midsummer. Now, if we get to 30, 40 acres, I probably would. So that would be a toss-up. Now, the next ones probably push it down toward, are more advantageous to extended season grazing. So let's think about drought. So if we're feeding 150 hay feeding days, even if that table tells us to, if we're there versus, say, 90 days and we have a drought, which one are we going to be in bigger trouble with? With 150 hay feeding days, right? Because we're going to have a whole lot more cattle. We're going to have to get through a drought. So in other words, just because of that risk of drought, and this is what I do on my farm, I'm stocking I have my stocking rate a little bit lower than what that ideal would tell me just for that purpose. because I know I'm going to have a drought at some point. So in other words, if you look at the range in terms of where that ideal is, I might shift towards the bottom of that just for this reason alone, for the risk of drought. The next one is kind of similar, and that's pasture health, but this is probably more only geared towards the really extreme of the real high stocking rate. So when I say pasture health, I think what I mean there is, on not necessarily an average year, but if we have just a mild drought, think about a mild drought, and if we're feeding 150 days of hay feed, that basically means if we're starting grazing April 1st, we're feeding hay to, what is that, November 1st, I think? So if we have a mild drought, we might be feeding hay in early September, right? So if we're feeding hay on that, so if we're at 57 cows and we have a mild drought, that means we got the pastures grubbed to the ground when? In early September. What's going to happen to our pasture health at that point? It's going to go down. And the next spring, we're going to notice it. Two things. Next spring, we're going to notice it. But even if we get rain in October, are we going to get much growth? Not if we have the pastures grubbed down to the ground. So in other words, that would tend to say, even if that range says 120 or 150 days, you may want to bring it down to that 120, just for that reason alone. And the other one is these results really are only geared towards the eastern U.S. Western, the dynamics are going to change a little bit. The main one is the stocking rates will be different, but the relative, that isn't a problem. But just from what I understand, I've never done a whole lot in the western U.S., but my understanding is they are better able to use, say, that spring and early summer surplus later in the year without a drop in forage quality, or as much drop in forage quality. So that would change it for the western U.S. So I would not use that for those areas. And this is very quick, but what if you think that you either have a different cost structure, either higher, lower, or you think calf price is going to be higher or lower than what I'm showing? It's very easy. So if you think your base profitability is going to increase compared to what I showed up there, and there's two ways that can happen. One is calf price or higher, right? So if calf price increased by 11 cents, or if your cow costs decreased by $50, they have the exact same effect. And basically what you want to do is increase your hay feeding days by roughly 1 month. Actually, I think it's 24 days, but just roughly about 1 month. Does that make sense? And if it's reversed, if you think calf prices are 11 cents lower, in other words, instead of $1.40, you think they're more like $1.30 or $1.29, whatever that works out to, or if your costs increase by $50, what are you going to want to do? Feed more or less hay? You're going to want to feed less. Now, let me caution you, so let me just say this. If your costs are $50 higher than what I'm showing, or if you think calf prices are about 10 cents lower than what I'm showing, I would say you might want to consider what? Getting out of the cow-calf business, because I don't think you're going to be profitable. So that's my only caveat. In other words, this technically would decrease the feeding days, but my only point is you may have bigger problems than just that at that point. So in other words, let's take the bigger problems one at a time. But you would decrease your hay feeding days by roughly a month. So what is the appropriate stocking rate on most farms? Again, the answer depends, right? Depends on, and you've got two different tables and essentially a bunch of different scenarios in each one to decide from. But if someone just came to me and they didn't, they didn't know what their cost structure was on their farm, any of that, and all they knew is, and even if they didn't know their hay costs, if they're making hay and they didn't know what it is, I would just probably say somewhere in that range, 60 to 90 days, because it gives you the most flexibility. And if you're off by any of the assumptions, that 69 days will catch most, you will not be in any of the extremes. Now, that's not saying there's some folks that will be down. There are. If they really know their cost structure, you'll have people down there. All I will say, if you're at zero, you don't have a whole lot of flexibility, right? If you're zero, you can only move which way? Up. If you're at 30, you can do what? You can move up or down a little bit depending on conditions.